Hey everybody, I'm posting the video today because I have my second vaccination shot scheduled and it's happening kind of in the middle of the day. So, I could have come to school for the first 40 minutes and then left, but I've decided I'm just gonna make this. It'll be easier for everybody. So what I'm gonna do is walk you through today's assignment, and this one should be pretty straightforward. If you look on the calendar posted today, this assignment called Women's Suffrage is posted. So if you click on that and open it up, you're going to need the graphic organizer down at the bottom. So if we open that, it looks like this, and this will look familiar. It'll look very similar to some of the things that um, we've been doing lately. So we have one question before we get into the documents. It says, review the timeline in the slides for how long had suffragists been fighting for voting rights. So we'll do that, and then we'll have you go through 3 different documents. And then, as usual, there's a final reflection with the very specific prompts and directions. So if you're following directions here, you should be able to do pretty well, pretty straightforward. So let's start. I'm going to open up those slides and we'll kind of do a quick review of the timeline. Our focus question today is, why did people, including women, oppose women's suffrage? So suffrage is voting rights. And, oftentimes I think we would look at a question like, when did women get the right to vote? And we would say, well, of course, everybody believed that women should have the right to vote because that's kind of the mindset we have today. So I think sometimes looking at these questions historically from kind of the opposite angle, what would be the arguments against this? It's hard to get our brain to that place, but I think it'll help us understand the era better. So that's why we're doing it this way. It's a little strange, but it'll make sense as we go. So if we look at the timeline, going back to the mid 1800s, I think some of you should remember the Seneca Falls Convention, 1848. This is where a number of women's rights activists, women's voting activists get together in, I think, New York, Seneca Falls, New York, and they end up putting together what they call the Declaration of Sentiments. So this was kind of modeled on something like the Declaration of Independence, but it's basically kind of the demands and the things that they were pushing for and trying to promote within that group. So that includes equal social status and equal legal rights for women, and included in that would be the right to vote. So most of these groups are not just about voting rights, but that's kind of the tip of the iceberg in terms of getting equal status and equal legal rights. Fast forward to 1872, we have a name that you should recognize, Susan B. Anthony. She registered and voted in a national election. And because of this, she broke the law. It was illegal for women at this point. They put her on trial, and she was charged with violating the 14th Amendment, which the 14th Amendment says people should have equal rights. So it's kind of ironic that that's what is used against her, and she loses. So we have kind of a timeline of people actively pursuing things. I think sometimes what happens is when you look at when did women get the right to vote, we go right to kind of the period before this takes place, and we look at what those women are doing. But what we're trying to get here is that there's a long history of women pushing for voting rights in the United States. Fast forward to 1890, we have a couple of different organizations put together, the NWSA and the AWSA. They merged so that they could be one stronger group called the National American Women Suffrage Association. And by the early 1900s, you start to see things shifting in terms of kind of gender and expectations. So women are now more likely to be going to college, more likely to be politically involved. They are also the people that are working in a lot of those progressive movements, trying to help with some of the problems in society. If you remember the progressives from the end of last semester, many of the people that are doing this kind of work are women. And so, the culture is starting to shift in the early 1900s. By 1915, 40,000 women and men marched in a suffrage parade in New York. This was the largest parade up until that point that had ever been held in the city. So, clearly there were supporters for this change to happen. January of 1917, another name you should know, Alice Paul. She was one of the leaders of the NAWSA. She and her supporters began to picket the White House, the first time that anyone had ever done this. So they stood outside the gates of the White House with big signs that basically said, shame on you, President Wilson. We should have voting rights. That was not the words, but basically pushing for women to have the right to vote. I'm going to suggest, oh, it's not even active, so I'm not going to suggest. There is a movie called Iron Jawed Angels. If you are curious about or interested in what's going on at this time, Hilary Swank is one of the leads. I think she's Alice Paul. And it kind of gives you a timeline of what this actually looks like. And the movie's pretty well done. So if you're looking for movies and you're bored during COVID, this is a good one that'll show you kind of what this all looks like. They do show the protests outside the White House and kind of the ensuing treatment that these women get, which is brutal. They get thrown in jail and are treated horrifically just for kind of voicing their opinion. So here are the three documents. We have document A from Molly Elliott Sewell. We have document B from an anti-suffrage newspaper in New York. And we have document C from the Tennessee representative named John Moon. So at this point, you're going to dive into the documents and work on that graphic organizer. The documents are this first link under the slides. So if you open those up, you will be able to do the sourcing you need for each document. And then you can work through the questions. Remember, the sourcing is down at the bottom, so it'll tell you a little bit about who these people are, where these documents came from. So the chart is pretty straightforward. By the way, what's the answer to question number 1? How long had suffragists been fighting for voting rights? So you have to do math. So it happens in 1919 is when it finally is passed. And they started this process, according to our timeline, in 1848. So I'm going to let you do a little bit of math and figure out what the answer is there. So we're going to put down the date and author for each document. That's kind of the sourcing material. And then 2 questions. According to this document, why did anti-suffragists oppose suffrage or voting rights for women? And then B says provide evidence from the document that supports those reasons. So this column here, the middle column, should be your words. So you're going to paraphrase and tell me what you get from that document, okay? Your words only. And then over here, I should see evidence. So this would be information right out of the document. So it could be a quotation or it could be a paraphrase of what you're reading. But direct quotes are okay on the right column. The middle column, your words. Evidence is specific language from the document. And you know how this works. If you fill out this chart well, then you should have a pretty good idea of the information that you're going to need to answer the reflection questions. Okay, so make sure you're digging through these documents and trying to pull out main ideas. There is one more question tucked away in here. It says, under what circumstances was the 19th Amendment ratified in Congress? When was the 19th Amendment ultimately passed? So if I go back into the slides, I have it right here for you. It says, after the U.S. entered World War I, many suffrage supporters argued that women should receive the vote as a war measure. It would prove that the Allies were fighting for democracy. So interestingly, this idea of what the U.S. is fighting for in World War I ends up coming back to bite some of the people that are against spreading democracy in the U.S. So this same kind of logic we saw on last Monday with Du Bois kind of arguing that we have African American troops fighting in World War I for democracies overseas, yet when they come back to the U.S., they're not treated as equal citizens. Women kind of pick up that same kind of argument here, saying that, if we're fighting for democracy, then why does half of the population not have the right to vote, being women? So January of 1918, President Wilson announces his support for a suffrage amendment. The House of Representatives ratifies that amendment. It then goes to the Senate and it gets defeated in the Senate. So it takes until 1919 for the Senate to finally take this up again and pass what would become the 19th Amendment. And we've talked about with Prohibition how amendments work. You know, once it goes through Congress, then it has to go to states, and the states have to vote to ratify it or to approve the amendment. So it's added. So 1920 is officially when that ratification process ends. The US becomes the 27th country to give women the vote after countries like Denmark, Mexico, New Zealand, and Russia. So, you know, our country, the United States, that says we're all about democracy, we were definitely not number one in this case when it comes to letting women have the right to vote. So I think that's it for today. Um, make sure that you're reading carefully through the documents. And again, your words in the middle column, evidence from the documents. These can be direct quotes. If you're using a direct quote, put it in quotation marks so I know that. And then when we get to the question, you know, the focus is, um, and the prompt is, do you think the most important reasons for opposing suffrage were political or social? So if we're talking about political reasons, it could be things like, you know, men don't want to give up their power or their political position. They're the ones that get to make decisions. If you think it's more social, things related to, you know, a woman's place in society and what their sphere of influence should be, you're going to have to kind of pick a side here and then argue for it. So I should see a clear thesis where you say, um, the most important reasons are, and you pick one of these, and then you're going to give me supports from the documents to support your thesis. When you're finished, um, you should submit this, and that's it for today. If anybody has questions, we can address those when I see you again in class next time. So have a good afternoon.